If you look up how to remove fence posts and tree stumps, you'll often see people using a high lift jack, sometimes called a farm jack or a ratchet jack. They dramatically cut down on the effort needed to pull things out of the ground, but only if you use them correctly. 20 posts and 5 tree stumps later, here are a few things I've learned about using jacks. Without something to connect it to the object you want to remove, the jack is rather useless. Here, I've used a heavy-duty welded chain. What matters is that you pick something with a pretty high tensile strength, because it is going to be under a lot of tension, and the last thing you want is for it to snap in your face. Lengthwise, it just needs to be long enough to wrap around the object twice and reach the bottom jaw of the jack. Mine was way too long, but that was the only length available in that gauge where I bought it. If it doesn't come with the chain, you'll need something to secure the chain in place around the object and on the jack. For light loads, you might get away with coach bolts or lag bolts for Americans, but don't plan on using them for something else after because they are going to suffer. A better and likely safer approach is to use hooks. I'd recommend going for something heavier duty than you think you'll need, just in case you do something wrong. I managed to bend a hook rated for 1000 kilograms just because I was stupid enough to try pulling a stump off the ground without cutting its roots first. Appropriate placement of the jack will make the job far easier. As a rule of thumb, you want the base of the jack to be as close as possible to the objects you want to pull out, so that most of the force goes into pulling up rather than out. You also want the base of the jack to be higher than the point where the chain wraps around the object, because you want the chain to start tensioning as soon as possible. However, you often can't butt up the jack against the post or the stump, because it will get in the way of the concrete or the roots as you lift. A common solution for this is to build some sort of an elevated platform for the jack to stand on, like a plank on some bricks for instance. All I had to play with was the post I had already pulled out, so I used those. If you can get away with leaving the jack on the floor, I would still recommend putting it on a plank just to spread the force. Otherwise, the jack will have a tendency to dig itself into the ground, which is wasted energy. Another modification that you often see in other videos is to attach supports to the jack, turning it into some sort of three-legged thing. This is to stop the jack's natural tendency to lean towards the objects it's trying to pull, especially if it's much heavier than the jack itself, which it usually is. I built my supports by drilling through 2 of the old posts and attaching them to the jack using a long coach bolt, threading it through the hole where the removable top jaw lives. I didn't use it every time, as it can make the whole setup a bit unwieldy, and most of the time I could just use my body weights to keep the jack under control, but in some cases it's really worth doing. You just have to make sure that the supports don't get in the way of what you're trying to lift. Another potential difficulty is making sure the chain doesn't slip off either the jack or the object. On the jack side, I used to wrap the chain around the bottom jaw a few times and tie it with a coach bolt to prevent it from unraveling, but it always ended up slipping. Then I realized I could use the hole that is just below the jaw. There's probably a proper thing to be used here, but I just fed the coach bolt through it to keep the chain in place. The jaw is going to be bearing the load, so this doesn't need to be super strong. At the other end, you'd be surprised how friction alone can keep the chain in place. But you have to wrap it tightly enough, otherwise it might just slip or unravel as you start lifting. For the more slippery or brittle objects like concrete bases, I would wrap the chain around twice and hook it onto itself, adjusting it so that the hook faces the jack. I had marginally better results by hooking the chain under the first loop, but your mileage may vary. Finally, here's a couple of pointers once you're ready to lift. First of all, you don't have to start ratcheting from the bottom. You can reverse the gear into the lower position and then slide the carriage up until the chain starts to pull. Then reverse gear again and begin lifting. And finally, I've mentioned it in a previous video, but it bears repeating, ratcheting should be very easy. You might need to pull a bit harder to tear some roots apart, but if you have to throw your whole body weight on the lever to make it move like I'm doing here, just stop. Something's blocking the object. Lower the jack, find and remove the obstruction, then try again. This will be safer for you and kinder on your equipment. So there you have it. I hope these tips were helpful enough to earn your subscription, and I will see you on my next project. Bye!